Hi everybody, my name is Michael Procco. For those of you who don't know me, I am a master's student at the University of British Columbia, and I pretty much study wildlife coexistence. That's a very general way of describing what I do. But as is kind of custom up here, I want to very briefly acknowledge that I am broadcasting from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Coast Salish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, or what is now commonly referred to as Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm making this video because if I wrote all of this out, nobody's going to read it, and I think some of you might actually want to watch this, maybe. But as a little preamble before my ramble, I know this video is long, but I made it really easy for you to skip through and find the sections you're most interested in hearing about. So as a brief overview of what you're going to find in this video, I'm going to talk a bit about Colorado's history with wolves and Colorado Proposition 114, or as some of you may know it better, the wolf reintroduction measure on Colorado's ballot this year. Specifically, the topics I'm hoping to speak towards are why this reintroduction is even on the ballot, what changes we might see if wolves are reintroduced, and some of the possible downsides to the reintroduction, including perspectives of ranchers, concerned taxpayers, hunters, and so on. So without getting too buried in the details, let's jump right into it. For a tiny bit of history, wolves were extirpated or made regionally extinct in Colorado by about 1940. So we've got this ecosystem in Colorado that has settled over the course of 80 or so years to become what we see now, which means that we need to be really careful when we're considering whether or not we're going to reintroduce wolves to Colorado. So if you asked me this question 5 years ago, whether or not we should reintroduce them, I would have said yes outright. But in my time studying wildlife biology in general, I'm a bit more hesitant to jump to that conclusion right away, which may be a surprise to some of you who know me personally. To answer the question of whether or not we should reintroduce wolves to Colorado, I want to first talk about why we might want to do that. So proponents of this bill are saying that we need to restore the howl so that we can bring back the balance of the ecosystem. But frankly, there's not a ton of evidence that the ecosystem is all that unbalanced. This concept of restoring the balance seems a bit sensationalized, and honestly the media loves to hype up the Yellowstone reintroduction up a lot, so that the Colorado reintroduction can follow in its footsteps. The truth of this topic is that the Yellowstone reintroduction success was amazing for the wolves themselves, and people like to pat ourselves on the back saying, "We did that," and that's all wonderful. After wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, ungulate species like deer, bison, elk all seemed to simmer back down to manageable levels. And then the vegetation was able to grow back to similar levels as they were before wolves were extirpated from the land, which is also amazing. In wildlife biology, this is what we call a top-down effect, where the top of the food chain affects the lower parts of the food chain by controlling the intermediate portions of the food chain. But the remainder of the Yellowstone success story is under constant scrutiny, and honestly the minutiae of what actually happened is up for debate to this day. The key point to take away from Yellowstone reintroduction, though, is that wolves restored some semblance of balance to an ecosystem that was previously unbalanced in some way. Which brings me back to Colorado. When you look around, do you see any unbalance? The place is beautiful, vegetation seems to be thriving, and aside from the recent fires, you might think that the ecosystems are actually doing alright for themselves. But sometimes balance isn't so easy to see. Beyond the possible overgrazing being undertaken by America's largest elk population, one interesting but less talked about reason that Colorado is proposing wolf reintroduction isn't actually to mimic what happened in Yellowstone at all. The wolves aren't supposed to reshape the rivers of Colorado or whatever they did up in Yellowstone. Instead, the reintroduction is in part geared towards stomping out CWD, a neurological disease that tons of deer and elk in Colorado are battling. If we take a quick look at this map from the U.S. Geological Survey, we can see that Colorado is practically the epicenter for this disease. In Colorado, hunters are often required to submit samples of brain matter for CWD testing if they've harvested a deer or elk from a certain game unit that has been recognized as a CWD source. In this map, you can see these highlighted in red, and the red numbering relates to CWD positive locations where they have noted that there's CWD in the area, but it's not too big of a concern that you need to report it. Now, it's unknown if CWD transmits to people, as the effects take years to show up, and the CWD outbreak is relatively new. But to be safe, if the brain sample is CWD positive, the meat has to be thrown out. So in this, all the hard work that a hunter puts into tracking, shooting, cleaning, packing, transporting the animal could be for nothing if the damn thing has the disease. And then to the extent of my knowledge, the hunter doesn't get their tag back. Because as far as I can tell, once you harvest an animal, you attach the tag to the animal, and then you can't get that tag back if the brain sample comes back positive. And please, please, please correct me if I'm wrong. I've spent all afternoon trying to find whether or not that's actually the case, but I can't find any literature on it, and I think that really it seems like you're just kind of out of luck if you accidentally shoot a deer that has CWD. But enough about that. How exactly can wolves help with CWD? So one idea is that wolves will reduce herd size. Now this is constantly up for scrutiny because, to keep things simple, as a deer or an elk, is it easier to be spotted by a wolf if you're in a herd of 200 instead of 20? And then you can flip that around and you can say, as deer or an elk, is it easier to defend yourself if you're in a herd of 200 or 20? So really, this point of contention is not something that we can draw accurate conclusions from. But I think the overall idea that we want to look at when we're talking about wolves and CWD is that wolves will reduce the population size, and a lower population size in general is indicative of lower transmission rates. Now you might be thinking, what about cougars? They hunt deer and elk, they're already here. Elk and deer numbers in Colorado are massive, and cougars are not keeping the populations down to adequate levels or reinforcing a strong enough fear response to show significant behavioral change in herds. This is probably because cougars maintain large territories but small densities, so only a few individuals take up a lot of space on the land. Wolves, on the other hand, occupy similarly large territories, but they do so in packs, which require much more meat to keep living. So in theory, the effect of wolves on herd size could be bigger than that of cougars. Though I don't have any literature, I didn't spend a ton of time looking into that. These are really just my opinions and my ideas, speaking from my experience in this field. Also, as an aside, predators in general like to avoid risky situations and take advantage of easy ones. They're opportunists, so when they're faced with a choice between a big bull elk and a runt with a disease eating its brain, wolves and cougars alike are probably more likely to chase the latter, which would help reduce CWD transmission even further, although it has been noted that the prions in CWD still remain in the ground after a kill. So whether or not it's actually being reduced is also up for debate. But this theory that the predators are going to go after the weaker prey is also why human hunters don't really need to worry about competing too much with wolves for the big bucks or bulls. In fact, most studies show that ungulate herds in wolf territories are stronger and more resilient than those in landscapes without wolves. So playing devil's advocate, what are the downsides to the wolf reintroduction? The livestock conflict is by far the biggest issue at the forefront of this debate. Ranchers shouldn't have to worry about losing money because wolves were reintroduced. That's not fair at all to the ranchers. That's why this ballot measure includes a compensation program. Now, similar programs in states that already have wolves require ranchers to report wolf kills to their local agricultural department, and at that point, an assessor visits the property to document the kill, takes the age, the weight of the killed animals, they ask whether it was a purebred or not, and all of these details come together to provide a specific dollar amount to be paid back to the rancher. Minnesota, for instance, allows up to $20,000 in compensation per rancher per year for wolf kills, so losing money is less of an issue. Of course, determining fair compensation is super difficult. And it would be great to have ranchers weigh in on how these assessments should be performed and what different values should be associated with different weights, different breeds, different ages. And that way the state could ensure compensation programs are generous enough to really make this worthwhile. Final concern that I want to talk about is cost. Beyond the prior details, the reintroduction is going to be expensive. Estimated costs are around $350,000 for the first year just planning, then $400,000 for the next, and increasing even more for monitoring, support, and staffing after the reintroduction actually takes place in 2023. This is expensive, but it creates new government jobs to carry out the process. And in terms of state expenses, these numbers aren't absurd. They're costly, though, and we can't overlook that. And so some people say, wolves are already in Colorado. We don't need to waste this tax money on something that's already happening naturally. And yeah, there is mounting evidence that wolves have been moving in and out of Colorado, but they are not established in packs, and honestly, it's pretty unlikely that they would establish packs without some sort of outside assistance. But if you're one of those people that says, really, it's just a matter of time until they reintroduce themselves naturally, if that happens, livestock owners are going to have a massive battle in front of them to try and get compensation for lost cattle. By investing state money into the reintroduction effort now, we might be wasting tax dollars on something that would probably happen eventually, but this action comes with the benefit of having an enforced compensation program already designed, on top of a dedicated team of biologists constantly monitoring the wolves to make sure things go smoothly. So there's no fight for livestock owners to get compensation for any wolves that kill their livestock. This ballot measure is a chance for ranchers to capitalize on a phenomenon that, according to some people, is already impending. Without the ballot measure, the ranchers are going to have a long fight ahead of them. So between the hunters, the livestock owners, and the taxpayers, there's a lot of people who are opposing this, and I get it. I 100% understand those concerns. And at the end of the day, I'm not going to persuade you to vote either way. But what I am going to do is ask that you do vote, because voting is really important, especially with these sorts of things. I know the Electoral College kind of, oh God, it's a nightmare. And we feel like we don't have a ton of power when it comes to the president. But these smaller things you do have power in. And it's really important that you exercise that right and you make your voice heard so that whether you want wolves or not, you can say, okay, I had a fair chance at having my say. So with that, that's all I've got to say. Peace and love. Thanks for listening. If you have any more questions, you know where to find me. Cheers.